All right. Okay. So yeah, I'm actually really happy that we have Lisbon and there's a smaller group, even though it's still a bunch of people. And I mean, just if you look at the delegate conversation we just had, right, there were maybe like half of everyone here contributed, maybe less than that, but it's still like, I mean, I think we're to some extent, right, we're seeing the limits of what huge calls can achieve in terms of governance, basically, right? Because I mean, that's one of the things we touched on. Is like shit's complicated, right? It's crazy complicated, and it's a lot to expect random people to even know what to do or say or chime in on it. And then in practice, you typically have the professionals, right? They're the ones that discuss it, and even then, it's still hard to have sort of an effective debate. Okay, let me try to. Like that. Okay, does it work now?
Looks good.
All right, okay, so I call this the decentralized community and the decentralized workforce. The basic idea is to really start thinking about sort of thinking about governance in a more, let's call it Byzantine way, maybe is a good way to think of it, right? A more adversarial, more game theoretic way, right? Where we really start to sort of recognize the different incentives that exist, and then also just like the different roles that arise from that, and how you can use this to your advantage to basically create something that is a lot more effective, right, and makes everyone happier, right? Oh, what, like this, right? Because so this is sort of my overall sort of assessment of like what have we achieved with maker governance, right? It's by far the most advanced, the largest, the most impressive governance system in anywhere in crypto, right? We've actually done this like huge decentralized organization, and we've shut down the foundation, and we have these like cool achievements that actually prove the model that we've adopted. But then at the same time, I mean, there's there's a lot of issues that are some of them are basically called like elephants in the room, right? They're not really bubbling up to the surface or sort of the highest level of governance, but that you really bump into if you go out to what I would call the grassroots, right? So it's just sort of random people holding MKR, right? And and one thing is really obvious is that we're in this transition phase where it's just going to take a long time for for a bunch of people to completely reinvent how to do organization, right? I mean, that's basically what the core units are doing right now, and it's absolutely guaranteed that going through that process is going to be difficult and painful, and you're not going to get quick results, right? But but ultimately that's still what people are upset about, right? And in particular, there's this problem with basically like this sense of like the budget, right? This total disconnect between sort of regular MK holders and then the budget, and how they're seeing the, you may have seen the discussion in this various threads that pop up on Reddit, which I really think is like that's the best place we have right now, sort of a proxy for basically the sort of the grassroots community that's disconnected from the governance process, right? Where to them it's basically like some kind of the surplus buffer goes up and then they clause them out of it, right, again and again. So that there's like this, and it really is, I mean, it really is a case right now, right, that actually nobody knows what's our yearly budget and yearly MKR expenditure. I actually don't think that there's any place for me to just go and have a look at it. Maybe there is, but like I don't know about it, and I definitely know that there's like no single sort of person or core unit or responsibility somewhere for someone to sort of track that, right? Even though if you think about how, that's kind of how you would do it if you were thinking from this sort of top down, right? That like the most important thing is you want to sort of be able to sort of track and see what's going on in the big picture, right? And I mean, I wrote this also in the Clean Money post, right? That there's like a very obvious reason for why this is the case, and that's because basically the foundation just kind of like, just like let the co-units go on their own, and there was zero support from the foundation, right? All because of regulatory concerns that the co-units really had to be truly decentralized. So that's what happened. They became truly decentralized to the point where there isn't even a place to sort of track the budget, right, or get a sort of a global picture of what's going on. But yeah, like, I mean, there's this frustration around the budget, right? That like this money question, right? That really, I mean, I really think that that's a big reason why the MKR price is doing badly, right? It's like that when you go to read about MKR on Reddit, then you get a bunch of people saying, they're taking the money, right? Like and it's this disconnect between the community and, I mean, I'm used to I often call it the governance bureaucracy, but I think really the right term to use is the decentralized workforce, right? That there is this like decentralized workforce of professionals that are doing great work and being paid for it. But there is like a disconnect between the budget and sort of the budget going in, and then sort of the interests of MKR holders. And then there is also this phenomenon of the bureaucracy running itself, right? So that, for instance, now we were just discussing delegation, and basically it was a bunch of mandated actors and delegates talking about, how MKR holders should pay delegates, right? And basically little participation from MKR holders, if you consider that it really should only be MKR holders that discuss that, right? I mean, they're basically considering how they want to allocate their money, right? And of course you can, I'll get to that later, right? But I mean, of course you need to take input from the professionals, right? But you need to also really consider who they are and what their incentives are, right? And then there's also this, I mean, there's all this like hidden communication and all this stuff that's sort of how governance works today in Maker, which is just it's like a natural sort of extension of how things ran in the foundation, basically, right? So it's like the foundation necessarily had to be highly secretive, basically out of regulatory concerns, in how, in a sort of, really in how it was able to communicate, right? And then there's just never been sort of a change to that approach, right? So Maker has just always been this sort of this project where there are a lot of these internal groups that make sure to sort of keep information to themselves, in large part, I guess, out of the instinct of basically not wanting to cause regulatory risk. But of course, I mean, if you think of it in terms of decentralized governance, it's just it's a problem. And like more broadly, right, like this whole question of like MKR holders versus the decentralized workforce, right? Like the decentralized community, which is supposed to basically, right, I mean, sort of be the MKR holders, right? That the whole thing is supposed to work for, right? And then the workforce is supposed to work on their behalf. But the problem is that the two sides are just so unequally sort of matched up, right? Where you have the community basically don't really have anything going for them other than crying on Reddit. And then the workforce kind of have all the cards in their hands, right? And yeah, like the solution to this problem is to basically push on both sides. So we need to empower the decentralized community so that they actually have the resources and the sort of the access points, and then just like the voting power basically, and the and then even and things like this, the incentives to increase the participation. And then we also need to structure the workforce to be sort of maximally manageable, I guess, is one way to think of it. But another thing is just like really, I mean, well, and that's the thing, right? So this is, in the end, like the question of like organization is primarily about allocating money and resources, right? It's like money goes in and then results and value comes out, right? And that's most of it. And from that perspective, you can also you can think of like, what is the ideal decentralized workforce? Well, it's a decentralized workforce that basically is this, like a machine where you put budget in one end and then you get profits out. You get way more profits out the other end, right? And basically the random random people on Reddit that are upset about core units stealing the surplus buffer, if they just sort of, I mean, all they need to know is that, well, when they take budget from the surplus buffer, they're taking it so they can do work that's going to result in more money going into the surplus buffer over time, right? Then actually that's sort of all they need to know, right? But that, you know, unfortunately that's not a simple challenge, right? That is sort of that is really just the challenge itself. Okay, and so how do we empower the community, right? So I've come to realize that there is this sort of just the single most powerful resource in Maker and sort of DAOs is this concept of the semi-altruistic outspoken power voter, which is, I mean, basically people that, you know, that vote not for what's best for them personally exclusively, right? But then what's good for them and what's good for other MPR holders, right? And then they speak about how they vote and why they vote to the point where it sort of impacts, you know, behavior elsewhere. And then they just do it consistently, right? And I'm not actually sure if we have anyone like this right now. Maybe we have some people that sort of vote and talk about it and connect their votes to their opinions. But we definitely don't have any like large scale voters like that, right? I mean, the best we've got are then the delegates right now. But even the delegates are somewhat different because ultimately they have, I mean, they need to be, they're professionals. They have some expectation of compensation, and for it to truly work, we need these like semi-altruistic actors ultimately. Like you just can't make a system like Maker work if MKR holders aren't going to sort of directly enforce the kind of behavior that they think is going to be best for them as MKR holders. And so because there's a semi-altruistic element, this is where like clean money and a sort of a compelling vision for social good is actually crucially important, because that sort of, if you know, you're way more likely to be semi-altruistic when it comes to governance if you're sort of contributing to something that itself is semi-altruistic, right? It kind of sucks to be altruistic towards people that are just in it for the money. So you're sort of giving something up yourself so other people can get a bunch of money for doing nothing, right? That really sucks. And if there's some greater purpose to it, then it helps. And then there's this the element of the tokenomics and the Sagittarius engine that basically, I mean, the reason why I proposed that and taking this approach to like getting people locked up with tokenomics is exactly because that's the best. I mean, that's the best sort of solution to this fundamental problem I've come up with so far, is that if you can lock people up, then they're just you're more likely to push them towards that point where they're going to go from passive to active participants. And then it's, you know, it's not just like having the power and having sort of the incentive, but then there's also structuring the workforce so that it also is sort of, you know, that it, you know, so we're creating a hammer, and then we also need to create the nail where you can sort of hammer as a part of the you know, like so that you have the incentive to act and you know how to act, right? Yeah, and really this is, so much of this is about like having a convincing way where MKR voters can can ultimately impact how money flows through the workforce. So they know that when they basically increase the budget, then they get even more value out, right? Because they know they can operate this evolutionary process that drives the workforce towards, you know, just continuously refining and improving how it generates value for them. And yeah, so I call it the MKR mafia, right? It's like this idea of that's what happens if you actually have an organized elements of these semi-altruistic outspoken power voters that sort of identifies people that work together and band together in order to affect governance so that they can make more money and achieve you know, the shared vision and the potential of the project that they're in. And then it's just like these, I mean, this is just like some concepts that I think are important to mention to sort of really get into this, like the problem of basically like a decentralized bureaucracy, right? With no regulator and no boss, right? Which is why the MKR mafia is so important. We need to have that in place, because without it, then basically this is the kind of stuff that is almost guaranteed to happen in and so there's the concept of power spiraling, right? Which is like, once you have some political clout, you can use that, you can choose to use that to gather more political clout. And that's basically how politics works in general, right? But in a system like Maker, if there's no sort of natural check on that, then what happens is you end up with a single point of control, right? Because whoever sort of starts off at the furthest ahead can just use that to get even further ahead, basically. And then something that's pretty unique to like a DAO and the attempt to make things highly decentralized is this concept of private entanglement, right? So that is where you have individuals in a decentralized workforce that basically, instead of sort of attaching things to their, let's say like the core unit or something like that, right? Or maybe even not even attach, like sort of actually decentralizing it rather than attaching it somewhere, then there is actually an incentive for people to get personally sort of entangled in processes and really any kind of structure, because then you just get an edge, you get sort of an advantage against against the MKR holders, right? Because it's extremely hard for them to figure out how entangled are you and what are the risks of trying to untangle that. And then it becomes even more difficult for them to organize around actually doing something about it. So this is the kind of stuff that really stacks, that if you don't think very carefully about how you structure the decentralized workforce, you're it will naturally be stacked very heavily against you're serving the interest of MKR holders, right? Which is actually what's called the iron law of bureaucracy, right? That fundamentally, that's how very often sort of it happens in a bureaucracy, right? That there just are these like very strong incentives that drives it away from that really drives sort of anything, I guess, in nature towards its own self-preservation, right? But I have spent at this point many years really to like thinking about this fundamental problem, right? Of like, how do you create a decentralized workforce that doesn't immediately sort of blow up or not immediately, right? But that doesn't over time blow up and corrupt and sort of become inefficient and become sort of works for itself, right? Because that is a natural direction something like the workforce, a DAO workforce would go, because it lacks a CEO, it lacks a board, and ultimately it lacks a government, right, and regulation. It lacks that sort of like, if you don't create it somehow, it lacks that point where there is that kind of sort of altruism that looks to see what is actually the way things are supposed to work, right, and looks out for sort of the greater good, right, instead of everyone just considering their own interests. And so the most important of the concepts of this is what I call separation of powers, right? So it's really about trying to cut up the bureaucracy into these like bite-sized, manageable pieces, where you can then achieve two things. So first of all, you can achieve what I call the power ceiling. So basically, you can try to sort of define the limit of how sort of powerful and how important any single piece should be, right? And that's also just the concept of like not having a single point of failure. And then also you can enforce transparency, or at least you have a much better control over transparency, because you can sort of define these separated pieces and the relationships between them in ways that and put in place requirements that basically promote transparency and just make it, just lack of transparency becomes sort of possible. It becomes more quantifiable, essentially, which then makes enforcement easier. And enforcement is just the most fundamental thing, right? And sort of what really maybe one of the most fundamental things that are sort of missing today in maker governance, right? Is like what happens if we want to like fire facilitator, right? That is supposed to be sort of a key piece of how it all works, but like it's not something we've even started to consider yet, right? Because there's just really have no idea what would that actually look like in practice. Then there's this concept of the world map, which is basically the idea of we need to be able to create an ice age, right? We need to be able to know exactly what is it we do and how do we do it, and how does it create value for MKR holders? Because that's sort of the most important piece in the end, that like these things are gonna, like the way to prevent all of this stuff from spiraling out of control is to really remember and sort of understand why is it all there. Basically, it's there because MKR holders are paying for it, so they get more value in return. And then, then you can split things into profit centers and cost centers. I think this is one of the most crucial things we really need to move towards. And the onboarding of the collateral engineering services core unit, for instance, might be, that's sort of a big win in terms of really getting a very clear profit center on board, right? Like, so a place where, as an MKR holder, I know that I can allocate budget there, and I know that that budget is going to get put to work to really sort of deliver some, deliver short-term, maybe not short-term, but like deliver cash flows in sort of this very direct way, right? Where they're going to take that budget, they're going to use it to onboard collateral, and we're going to be making money off that collateral. Whereas cost centers is like, you really need to, they're extremely important. In fact, they're actually, in a way, they're more important than profit centers, because cost centers include things like technical security maintenance, right? Which, like, without that, you just die. But you really need to sort of understand that something is a cost center, and then you need to understand what does that mean in terms of what are we then looking for. If we're pouring money in here and we're not going to get money back out, then what kind of value are we going to get back out that ultimately result in this thing becoming sustainable, right? And to help with this, help with these things, there's this stuff called the meta governance infrastructure. And once I make a post about this stuff, I'll get a lot more in depth there. But the idea is you have things like SES, right? And you have things like the governance core unit, and to some extent, governance communications is another example of this, right? Where you have this sort of a part of the bureaucracy that sort of is focused on itself rather than focused on doing the work. And then there's this so-called iron law of bureaucracy that basically says that this meta bureaucratic sort of part of a bureaucracy over time will take control, and then will sort of turn the bureaucracy into a self-preserving entity, right? But with transparency and with, I think, with the vision, with the sort of the, this different way that we just work and we interact in a DAO, I think that there's a possibility of sort of doing the opposite in a way, right? Where we actually are able to create this sort of meta infrastructure that works to the, sort of to the benefit of MKR holders, right? And to the benefit of the project, by actually helping to optimize and helping to find the problems basically and propagate them. And that was also discussed earlier, right? This idea of like people that basically help out the voters with figuring out how they, surfacing the data that they need to find out there's a core unit that's performing badly and should have its budget cut, right? Or there's someone over here that's doing a really great job, and for some reason they're completely underfunded and they should have their budget increased, and so on, right? And there should be like having internal processes that constantly try to evolve and improve and optimize is crucial to empowering MKR holders and empowering the decentralized workforce to become value creating. And then there's reporting and transparency, right? So basically KPIs, which they exist to some extent right now, but they need to be really standardized. They need to be like as simple as I see budget go in and I see more value than what I put in coming out in some shape or form, right? So that we can really simplify it and reduce it to the point where it's actually digestible for the sort of grassroots. Okay, so yeah, this is where now we're getting a bit in the weeds, right? But actually the main thing I want to focus on here is, I'm describing sort of three things that already exist to a large extent, right? There's the delegates. There's sort of the part where the decentralized community interfaces with the decentralized workforce. Then there's a mandated actors, and they sort of like, they hold this like ultimate trust and ultimate power, and they control the budgets, they control the executive votes. And then there's the private actors. So today, that's mostly things like security auditors. But basically, what I'm proposing is, as a part, like based on this principle of separation of powers, you really want to put most of the work out in the private actors, and yeah, like so. To sort of split things up so that you have the mandated actors taking more on a role of basically representing the DAO, right? Which they already do, but then they also represent themselves in doing the work, right? And that you very often have this, I mean, some people have talked about this self-dealing problem, right? Which we don't really have that yet, because I mean, we're just in this early stage where there just is a lot of trust, and basically people are good people, right? So we don't exactly have self-dealing issues currently, but we definitely have like a structure that's going to end up with that, right? Because you just have these like obvious conflicts where facilitators often are like, they're the sort of the one, they're ultimately, their closest relationship is with their team and with the people that are doing work and that are getting paid, but they're looking out for MKR holders' interest in terms of how, getting the best deal and being as efficient as possible with the resources and so on. And that's sort of a really obvious example where if you split it up and you have separation of powers, then you can have mandated actors that control the purse, right? They control the budget, they decide who to pay, and then they can sort of go through kind of an open process, right? Decentralized process of picking the best provider, which I think you can compare that a little bit to like government procurement, right? Which is actually a very good comparison to what the maker needs. But what's really crucial here is this concept of the budget allocators. So like the idea that it needs to be like an entire category of sort of a part of this overall process that is entirely focused on the concept of like raising budgets and cutting budgets, right? And dealing with compensation, dealing with things like performance and how it relates to compensation and how it relates to budgets. And I think that just having that really will change so much, because the concept is that you can, and this is an old concept, by the way, so it's something that I think has been proposed in public some time, a couple of times in the past, and it's basically this idea, right, that you should be able to, not only can you vote for proposals with your MKR, but you can also sort of vote for budget allocation with your MKR, right? So you could right, like if you have two people with 100 MKR each, and they each vote to sort of put their budget power towards a core unit each, then those core units each have equal amounts of budget power, and then they basically get to split the allocated budget, which of course can't be all of it. So I'm not, so it's kind of this idea is kind of like a hybrid model that's built on top of how we already do things. But it's really important, because sort of this is one of my big points of all of this, is that we need to drastically increase the workforce, right? We need to increase the budgets. We need to increase the complexity of all of this, because we need to hit that critical mass where things actually work sort of end to end. And then having sort of increasing the budget in a smarter way, where when you increase it, you can also decrease it again, is going to be really crucial. Okay, so then like this is like the idea of meta governance, right? So you have things like development, collateral onboarding, risk, all these core units, right? They're sort of the ones who are actually doing stuff. And then you have you have what I call internal controls, which is like it's a role I think, for instance, SES or an offshoot of that could play, where the idea is like, look at best practices in that we observe in one core unit, and then try to basically teach that to other core units, right? And look at sort of budgets, and look at KPIs and sort of just monitor and analyze all this data and basically see whether, basically just systematically look at taking a professional perspective on how good it looks in a sense, right? And you could split it up into things like HR, finance, and this kind of stuff, right? But overall, all of those things are sort of internal focused processes that exist not to actually do any external work, but rather to improve the external work that's being done by others. And then we have this the most important meta governance stuff that we've had from the very beginning, which are the governance facilitators, right? So that's basically and that's a fundamental part of that we in a sense take for granted now, right? That none of this stuff works at all unless we have these highly trusted people that basically, it's kind of fun, right? The entire Maker governance process is almost like a blockchain by itself, right? That sort of exists in the head of Longer Wisdom and Payton, right? And to a certain extent, they could actually do anything they wanted and allow anyone to do whatever they wanted in terms of weird whatever proposals and all of this stuff, right? And it's only because we sort of all believe in it, and especially because they believe in it and they enforce it, that any of this stuff works. But I think that's also, and that's a really good example of how building on top of this concept can create a lot of power for us. Yeah, I'm just gonna skip this. And whatever, right? So I discussed this already, basically, that we need people that vote and talk about why they vote and influence the governance process and influence the decentralized workforce with their MKR, with their voting power, right? And so I've been hard at work to come up with a new tokenomics design, since the first one just wasn't really exciting enough, right? There wasn't really that sort of excitement around it. And I came up with something that basically gives us what everybody wants to a certain extent, in terms of, you get compounding returns in MKR, you get locked up, and it's like tax optimized as well. This thing I've come up with, because you use a tiny bit of leverage to create substantial risk of forfeiture, which is really important if you want a tokenomics system that is supposed to run for more than a year, right? That's supposed to run long term, because otherwise, in many, probably most jurisdictions around the world, the tax systems, they're just not meant to deal with something like that, and they can really become they can cause them to become very inefficient. Which doesn't matter if it's some degen short-term thing, right? But it matters. It has a huge impact when it's about sort of incubating this sort of a new generation of actually powerful MKR holders, right? That actually, as MKR holders, play this crucial base layer role in the Maker governance process. And then some memes or something, right? For the MKR mafia, cartels, right? This idea of how do we empower regular MKR holders to feel that connection with the governance process, and feel like they actually have a real way to impact how value is created for them. And in particular, as Sagittarius users, it's not just about creating value, it's actually even more importantly about protecting your principal, right? Because that's the biggest problem if you're locked up in the Sagittarius engine, is that you could lose all your money if there's some kind of big mistake, right? So encouraging this collaboration and basically right, banding together to have a bigger impact, I think that's really crucial. And the next, the point where then I think what could end up becoming, what I'm basically proposing should be the single most important piece of the entire sort of bureaucracy, the entire governance environment, is this concept of voter committees, right? So that are sort of that are permissionless, that are just created by MKR voters, that basically go out and publicly show they connect their votes to their identity, right? So you can actually prove, look, we are X amount of people, we have X amount of votes, and we operate in this public, transparent manner where we basically discuss different issues, and then we sort of connect our opinions to our voting behavior. And then this can become a place where you can have this sort of formal interaction between like delegates that are, that want to delegate in a way that benefits MKR holders, and core units that want to do their job in a way that benefits MKR holders, or simply that are asked to provide information that MKR holders want in order to help them better inform their voting behavior. And then, so, right, all that shit, the point is that then if we need all these things if we're going to execute on the clean money vision and have an impact on, attempting to salvage what's going to be left of the climate, basically going to be left of the world. And then as a part of that, we need to massively expand the workforce, right? I mean, and so there's all these like delegates I talked about, right? We need to give them MKR, we need to pay them really well because they're going to have this crucial role. And also, actually, just to add to that a little bit, right? I really think the job of the delegates, the full-time job of like the full-time professional delegates, is basically this participating in these voter committees, right? Because we could easily scale them up. We could have like hundreds of them potentially if we can just get enough MKR holders locked up in a Sagittarius engine and get them sort of interested enough in how they can impact the process. And then the delegates can really be the sort of the workhorses of sort of collating all that information across all these different committees. But beyond that, kind of building out and consolidating what we already have, then what we really, really need, I believe, right, is basically legal. So a lot of legal core units, a lot of government relation core units. And then finally, with that in place, we can get into like really large scale global marketing, because that's how all of this stuff is going to pay off. Basically, all this crazy complexity we've gone through so that we can have this orders of magnitude more complex and more advanced governance framework than any other project in the space. The thing that's going to make that pay off is when we begin executing these parallelizable marketing strategies, right? Where we can have multiple core units that are on one hand coordinated in terms of branding and messaging, but then at the same time actually can be, managed very individually, can have budget allocated based on results, and can just operate in this like very, highly flexible and decentralized manner, right? I think that could be sort of the one, just the one thing that could really sort of make Maker outcompete any other type of company that's existed so far, because the potential for this is just it's immense as long as we have the other pieces in place. I mean, the only thing is the major thing that holds back things like marketing is exactly legal and political concerns when it comes to trying to market something like a currency, at least. Okay, so that was it. I think that ended up being quite a bit. Yeah. Okay, I guess probably you guys not that surprised. I don't know if there were any good comments that I should answer. Yeah, so Long for Wisdom and Seb, you're saying you're MKR holder first. I mean,
well, Seb said that. I didn't.
Yeah, like
Yeah,
you
so
are.
I read it, and really, I mean, it's the truth. I mean, unless by being a facilitator currently, then I just have a mail from my bank freezing my bank account because I paid some lawyers in the Cayman Islands. So I have no interest. My only reason to be facilitator, because I think real world asset and real world finance, not real world asset, by the way, is important for Maker. It's interesting to help Maker because I own a lot of Maker token. And I usually don't trust anyone else but me. That's the reason. But I mean, I don't care. I mean, that's exactly the same for me to work for MakerDAO or not. I'm here because I'm MKR token holder first.
Yeah, I guess we should simply go and continue in the chat. But I think the best way to think about this is if you think about it as an MK holder first, right? I mean, that's the way to think about it. Like, think about yourself as an MK holder, and then think about others and sort of their incentives, right? I mean, that's the thing. In the end, even if you can trust yourself or trust someone you trust, basically, when you think about it systemically, the only thing you can really consider sort of reliably are people's incentives. All right. Okay.
And that's why I put another comment that is important. I think we shouldn't create a complex structure because that will not work. That never works. We should be small enough with a strong culture so everyone is aligned. If there is a strong culture, no matter the incentives, there is a strong culture that always wins. But you need to remain small, like less than 50 people working for MakerDAO, which is the opposite of your proposal, which is to create a big structure and a complex one. I think both can work, but it's not the same.
But I mean, yeah, you want a simple structure so that there's little things that can keep you in check, and you want few positions because you already have a position, right? I mean, that's just me putting it in this context of why it's why it's just fundamentally right, like this disconnect between MKR holders and the workforce, like it is fundamental to understanding how to structure the project, right? That like it ultimately, I mean, those might be great points, right? But it needs to be considered from the perspective of what do MKR holders want? What's going to benefit an MKR holder? And okay, we are absolutely, we've had enough. And the reality is, I mean, there's going to be a bunch of this shit coming to the forum, right? So we will really have the real discussion is going to play out in the forum. And hopefully maybe also on Discord now. I think that would be great. But so now you're all emotionally prepared. And this is going to be a very chaotic kind of time, right? I mean, and it already is. But there's just no way around it. We have to figure out who we are, right? We have to figure out how we're structured and what we're here to do and how we're going to do it. So
before we check out, Rune, interesting presentation. Can I make a comment? I'm listening to your discussion about, what you really want is a set of simple rules that can lead to complexity that basically takes into account transparency, accountability, and through a measure that is decentralized, right? And it's a tough question. How do you deal, the biggest issue, and this is really a question for you, and something to think about, is how do you deal with the fact in Maker that the tokenomics are such now that basically 80%, which maybe at most 50 people of the Maker is held by those 50 people who probably are not doing the lion's share of the work. In fact, I pretty much can safely say that 90 to 100 or 80%, 90% of the people are doing the lion's share of the work while 80% of the people get the returns, right? And so this becomes a general problem. We see it in regular corporate world, right? You basically are getting a risk reward for work early, right? And you have no real way to compensate that later. And then you're trying to do this all in this decentralized crypto space. I think there's an answer to it. And I've been working on my work rewards thing, which includes the tokenomics, which includes the governance, includes the accountability, in a model that has reasonably simple rules, but is dynamic enough that it can present pretty much all the outcomes you want, including what centralized finance has done for hundreds of years, and offers new opportunities for communities to kind of tailor the model to work for them, that has complete transparent accountability, that allows people to set their rates and to define the work that they want to submit, and allows the community to basically grade that work using a staking model, right? And so there's lots of different approaches that crypto basically gives that can solve this problem. The problem is actually coming up with a codable model that's simple, that can actually achieve the goals that you want, so that people can kind of, once they fall into it, everything they want comes out of it naturally. And then you can get growth and complexity and transparency and accountability naturally from a simple model. So we should talk at some point, and I should share with you my work rewards. Yeah, because everyone, every DAO I know and every company I know, but the DAOs see it strongly, is hunting for a model for how to do this in a way that the first 10% of the people that do the first 2 years of work don't get 90% of the rewards for perpetuity down the road. That's the real issue that's trying to be solved here. And to do that in a way that's equitable and fair and accounts for the value in a consistent way that's decentralized to boot, right? And so it's a tough question. I've spent 30 years of my life donating time to co-ops and intentional communities and Maker and DAOs, trying to hit upon an answer. And it's a two-pronged approach. It's one, defining what value is, and two, defining how you account for it.
And so listen, it sounds actually quite similar to, I mean, some of those things you mentioned it sounds to be sort of aligned with also what I mean, the way I'm viewing it and how to sort of stitch the whole thing together. But so I'm very excited to see that in the forum. I think it's going to be really great to get this more in-depth discussion. Right now, let's let me click the stop recording.